Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. Welcome to a new roundtable of the Dynamic Competition Initiative. Let me tell you just very briefly about DCI. So our mission, as you may know by now, is to develop and advance innovation-based dynamic competition theories, tools, policy processes, and frameworks that we seek to adjust to the nature and the pace of innovation in the 21st century. Our objective is to benefit society and the maintenance of an open and democratic liberal order. Now, that's a very long sentence. So to be concrete, what we do at DCI is that we organize roundtables. Today is one. We are engaged in education. We publish book reviews, including one of today's book. We publish also scholarly articles, etc. You can find all of our publications and other activities at dynamiccompetition.com. The website is up and running, so feel free to please visit the website and engage. Don't be a stranger. Send us emails and comments and suggestions. Now, today, we are thrilled to be receiving Neil Chilson, who for 25 minutes will give a presentation of his book. Neil is currently a senior researcher fellow for the technology and innovation at Stand Together. In the past, Neil has been the FTC chief technologist and a practicing lawyer. Now, something that is of interest for today's conversation is that Neil has 2 degrees, actually, a very rare thing in our field, one in law and another one in computer science. And he has a great book entitled Getting Out of Control, Emergent Leadership in a Complex World that we will be discussing today. After Neil, we will hear from Peter Klein for about 15 minutes. Peter is a professor of entrepreneurship at Baylor University. By the way, every time I pronounce that word, it reminds me of G.W. Bush, who once said there is no French word for entrepreneur, right? And Peter also is a senior research fellow at the, and I'm not sure how to pronounce that, Ball Center for Entrepreneurship and Free Enterprise. And then after Peter, we will hear from Asta Pundziene, who is a visiting scholar at the Institute of Business Innovation at the UC Berkeley since October 2018. She also is a full professor of strategic management and organizational psychology in the School of Economics and Business at Kaunas University of Technology in Lithuania. Without further ado, Neil, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. And let me figure out how to share my screen here so we can get going. Excellent. Yep. Okay. Well, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. I've been fascinated with the work of a huge number of people on this call for a long time, and really excited about what DCI is doing, and glad to contribute in any way that I can. And so I jumped at the chance to come on and talk about my book, Getting Out of Control. So I'll just quick overview of the book. What do I mean by emergent order, history of emergent order, and emergent order in public policy. These are selected topics from the book. I'm not going to go through everything in the book. As you all will know, either from the book itself or from the great summary that Natalia put together, this book is not particularly academic. It's not aimed at an academic audience. It's aimed at a popular audience, and it has a sort of self-improvement vibe, if I could say, but also I wanted to put in not just what emergent order means for our own personal lives and our lives in communities, but also given my experience at the FTC and in the legal world, what were some of the ideas that guided my work there, and how did I try to apply emergent order in complex systems when working at the Federal Trade Commission? So I'll talk a little bit about that, especially in the emergent order in public policy. I'll try in the last bit to tie it to competition in particular, which is not a focus, not an overall focus of my book, but has been a focus of my work over time, and maybe it'll be a focus of my next book. I guess we'll see. So I don't want to belabor this too much for a crowd that is probably hugely familiar with emergent order and as a characteristic of complex systems. It's a bit of a circular definition because complex systems are often defined as those that exhibit emergent order. And so there is no agreed upon definition for what is emergent order or spontaneous order, as Hayek would have called it. But there's a lot of, I find it easiest to explain in contrast to chaos or randomness and designed order. And so the analogy I like to use is, people walking into a stadium is random action. It can be very hard to predict where any one person is going to go. The type of placard messaging that a stadium crowd might put together to say something like big game or Caltech or whatever is an example of designed order. And then something like the wave that happens in a stadium is emergent order. It has instigators, it has participants, but they're all following sort of their own rules. But there is an overall pattern that you can see. Some of the key characteristics of emergent order are systems that are complex adaptive systems are often sensitive to initial conditions. So you can start them off with very, very small differences, and they will have very large changes in outcomes. Anti-reductionism, you can't summarize a complex system in a way that is that keeps all of the relevant information. Highly ordered systems, ones with a lot of rigorous hierarchies, often have they preclude complex emergent order. And then emergence often happens right on the edge of disorder and order, right at what complexity scientists would call chaos. I'm using these terms pretty loosely. But I feel very confident in using them loosely because everybody has very, very different definitions for many of these things. So I'm okay with picking the one that seemed to make the most sense for my particular audience. But I would love feedback from you all on some of those key characteristics. Really quick history of emergent order. Now, humanity has long, and thinkers across all of history have long explored the tensions between, are we masters of our own destinies, or are we controlled by others? Are we controlled by the natural forces or unnatural forces around us? Between autonomy and independence within groups and as individuals. But emergent order or spontaneous order as a field of thinking or a common set of themes is relatively recent and came up around the same time in two different main fields, which is biology and economics, which are, I suppose, the complex systems that humans are most trying to affect without being able to directly control. And so I think that maybe helps explain why it happened in both of those areas. In economics, it's not enough. I mean, not enough economists focus, I think, on complex systems. But obviously, I think they are all familiar with the concept of markets enabling individuals to coordinate behavior in very sophisticated ways without anybody being in charge of that behavior or the decisions. And so they can produce rational results despite the I have irrational here, but I think that's actually the wrong word. Despite the individual perspectives that individuals might have that might seem irrational to other actors. The unlegible maybe rationales behind people. I can't believe I'm talking about Adam Smith to this crowd. I won't much. But obviously he emphasized that specialization emerges without design, and that individuals who are acting on straightforward incentives can generate these very complex phenomena of emergent order. The term Russ Roberts points out that invisible hand, as Adam Smith used it, he didn't really mean emergent order. It's not really what he meant, but it is a really nice sort of shorthand, so to speak, for the concept. And it is a good way to explain it, even if that's not exactly what Adam Smith meant when he said in the invisible hand. Hayek obviously built on this and had a much more expansive view of emergent order that went beyond economics. In fact, Hayek influenced a lot of complexity science and computer science with his research on the use of information, the use of knowledge in society, and he in particular was skeptical of well, he was somewhat concerned that economics did not spend enough time thinking about complex systems, and that it was aiming at the things that it could measure and too often pretending that the things that it couldn't measure didn't affect the outcomes of economic systems, and was worried about the scientific approach to centralized solutions. In biology, this is Darwin, obviously the first, or the name that's most identified with some of this, and the lessons here are very similar, that there's an appearance of design that fits to function, but that in nature comes through several mechanisms which he tried to identify, such as natural selection, that pushed biology and biological organisms towards a fit into their environment. There was I think there's been an observation around the sort of three phases of emergent order study over time. I think we are in phase 2, crossing into phase 3. Maybe we're in phase 3. I do think that it's pretty interesting that when we talk about phase 3, that we've now built computational systems that are not explainable in a way, that try to capture some of this emergent order in digital systems, which is a bit of a oxymoron to do that. It's challenging to do that, but that we're using digital systems, which are supposed to be quite deterministic, to build emergent order simulators, essentially, and doing cool things with them now. ChatGPT is really fun to play with if you haven't, and I think it will be more than fun to play with. It's very useful. Just mentioned Santa Fe here. I'll just point out that it's interesting. The history of Santa Fe in many ways was one of physicists and economists fighting with each other. The early parts of it, especially, I think there was a lot of back and forth. There was an idea, I think, in the early optimism around complexity theory and study of emergent systems that this would give us the levers to control them. And I think especially in economics, that task became clear, I think, pretty quickly that was very difficult. And Santa Fe has never quite abandoned that hope, I think, or at least that sort of orientation to complexity science. But they've produced a lot of scholars who have focused on how can we describe and understand these systems in a way that might help us take a more humble view of what we might be able to accomplish with them. So, and that is a good transition to emergent order and public policy. When I was trying to justify in the book, and again, because the book is somewhat strange, I have a section that's on personal habit building, but also on public policy. I was trying to find a consistent theme across them, One of the ways for public policy that made sense was to highlight why government should care about emergent order. I think, first, it's part of the world to be governed. We can try to understand emergent order and emergent principles, and that can help maybe government make better choices about where to focus its efforts. But then I think third, and this is true of all complex organizations, large organizations, they themselves exhibit emergent order, and I think there are some important lessons to be learned from the interactions of decision makers within government at various levels of at various hierarchies, and what signals and barriers their information crosses, to learn some lessons for how we might design better systems or use the ones that we have better. Some of the high-level policy implications of emergent order. I think this won't be a surprise to economists of any kind, but anti-reductionism means your models are always going to be flawed. Limited knowledge and data makes certain types of prediction impossible. Imposing design can eliminate complexity. This is a point made, I think, quite forcefully by James C. Scott and Seeing Like a State and some of his other work. And then the knowledge problem that Hayek talks about is important for public policymakers to understand when they are trying to design solutions to the problems that they see in the world. John Holland has a great book. He's a University of Michigan, the originator of genetic algorithms, quite a smart guy. Talks about all well-studied complex adaptive systems exhibit lever points where a small directed action causes a large predictable change in an aggregate behavior. His example here is a vaccine creating long-term changes in the human immune system. But as he points out, and at present, the only way we can find these right now is trial and error. And we don't have a good theory across all complex systems to identify where there would be common lever points. And in some ways, that is the, like I was saying, for like the Santa Fe Institute and some other organizations, that was the ideal goal of such academic endeavors, was to identify an overarching theory that would allow you to point out the levers that you could pull in a complex adaptive system. And I think that has been somewhat abandoned, or at least cabined, by many of the people who dive deep into complex autonomous systems. It does not seem to be a generalizable type of theory. Jump through a few of these. I think one of the key things, having spent some time in a regulatory agency and having spent a bunch of time working with them, is the big differences that can come from the attitudes that are taken on by the decision makers in those organizations. And I think that understanding complexity and emergent order in the systems that are being governed can help regulators adopt a better attitude about what is possible. Now, I'd be curious what you all think about the political feasibility of this. The incentives that are on regulators are not always aligned with what might be the better policy outcome, as we all know. And so I would love to find those lever points that would help shift regulators' attitudes towards this, but I'm not quite sure what those are. I do have 4 tactics that I think that I more or less steal from James C. Scott, although he was not using them in this particular way, for how to guide government interventions in a way that recognizes the potential challenges that complexity that interventions in complex systems can bring. Minimizing simplistic legibility, which is the sort of templates that regulators might put on the world in order to understand it. By doing that, not only do they limit the complexity of the data that they gather, but also they can affect the system. I mean, the classic example that Scott mentions is when France forced everybody to take on last names, right? They had to do this as they became, as they started to tax people at the national level. Before, you didn't need a last name if you were just in a small town your whole life. And so by doing that, created a whole bunch of different societal effects that were not the intention of forcing people to get last names, but had that effect. James also talks about tempering ambitious plans with prudence and humility. Many times that means taking incremental, reversible steps in a system, in intervening into a system where you do not understand the whole of it. Another way is you can constrain the planner's ability to impose a plan. In the U.S., that can be things like, limited government restrictions, right? Constitutional provisions or statutes that limit what an agency or an intervener can do. And then fourth, you can increase the ability of participants to resist or shape such plans. Those are the systems that do that more will tend to produce not necessarily better outcomes. I think one of the things but ones in which there are more degrees of freedom for order to emerge rather than being designed. One of the things I tried to be careful about in the book is that it's very easy for me as a fan generally of emergent order to talk about it as if it's always great, but lots of things that we would call emergent order are not great. Externalities are, you can think of it in a way, there's at least a subset of externalities that are emergent. When you talk about, James Buchanan has a great article about pollution on a lakeside where it might not be in anybody's interest to spend the extra seconds picking up a small piece of trash they drop, but when everybody does that collectively, the beach becomes much less valuable to even anybody who attends. And those types of behaviors obviously can be emergent and they can be problematic. And the question for government interventions is, do you come back with a solution to those emergent problems that is designed from the top, or do you try to shape a solution that is emergent, such as norms? The example in the book I use in response to Buchanan's speech is, you could increase the fines for littering. You could, reward people who tattle on others. You could help run a public campaign that, increases the sort of social norms around not littering. And I think one good way to ask is, would I rather live in a community where we're sending our neighbors, we're complaining to the police to find our neighbors, or one in which the social pressures were such that you didn't litter, and in fact you might go beyond not littering and do something to help improve the beach for other people around. So those four tactics, I think, are I dig into those a little bit in here. Maybe I could just jump straight to competition rulemaking then, and then I would love to hear responses from the commenters and then all of you. So applying these four principles, as some of you may know, the Federal Trade Commission is in the process of doing some rulemakings around Section 5, its Section 5 authority. The most recent proposal is around non-compete clauses, and their proposed rule would ban nearly all non-compete clauses across the US. And The question is less, using that as an example, I would say, question is less like, is that good or bad? But I'm just trying to test it against these 4 principles that I had to see how does it measure up as a producer of or a policy that might enable emergent orders rather than restrict them. And so on the minimize front, I mean, I think simplistic legibility would be one that says, non-competes or this category of non-competes are always bad. Again, these types of heuristics can be useful, but they do tend to reduce the amount of information that you have in the system. And so a rule rather than, the current system, which is actually non-enforcement when you bring these contracts under state law, state contract law, is one in which maybe you've made it more legible, but it's perhaps oversimplistic and may ban situations in which non-compete clauses could be beneficial to one or both parties. Temper case-by-case enforcement tends to be an incremental approach, right? Obviously, a nationwide ban is kind of the opposite of incremental. A case-by-case enforcement-based approach tends to be more incremental. It's not a comprehensive solution, and so it may not meet all the political demands, but it avoids a one-size-fits-all sort of approach. Case-by-case enforcement also reduces the traditional Section 5 practice at the FTC is you identify a harm and you bring a case. That prevents sort of big picture, broad rulemaking. If you stick to that case-by-case approach, you can get a lot of cases wrong, and still there's a chance for the next defendant to win their case in court. Whereas broad rules, maybe you can get a lot right all at once, at least in the current environment, but then you're shaping the entire environment all at once as well, and there's less of a feedback loop that happens, or at least the feedback loop is truncated. And then finally, to the point I just sort of made, in case-by-case enforcement rather than a broad competition rulemaking, the participants can, at least under current administrative law in the US, can defend themselves somewhat more easily than under the deference standards that an agency would get for a law or regulation. And so if the goal was to increase the ability of participants to push back on the constraints, it would be case-by-case enforcement probably allows that more than a comprehensive law or regulation. Again, not really weighing in on the merits, but the merits of competition rulemaking overall. But I do think that descriptively, we could say that current antitrust law in the US is one that is more emergent order creating than one in which we would have a bunch of laws that prohibit specific practices rather than more of an enforcement driven approach. So I'll stop there. I really look forward to the discussion. And again, thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot. I was about to say 1 minute left, but I will start with the first joke of the kind. The natural order of your presentation came to an end at the right time. So thanks very much. I have lots of comments and questions I want to ask you, but I will keep that for part 2. I will now give the floor to Peter, and that's why, Peter, we invited you especially to comment on this book. He just published a book of his own entitled Why Managers Matter. So I'm very curious, and I'm sure I'm not the only one to hear about what you have to say about emergence, whether or not it's compatible with this need for managers and to not only rely on the, as you call it, the bossless companies. So Peter, on that note, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to participate. Thanks to Neil for writing the book and for his excellent synopsis. I really want to recommend Neil's book to anyone looking for a succinct, easy to understand and very thoughtful treatment on the concept of emergence. It's familiar to a lot of economists and to some legal scholars for sure, in terms of how we think about so-called spontaneous order or bottom-up modes of organization as opposed to top-down ones. But as Thibaut mentioned, I'm particularly interested in the middle section of the book, which talks about how these ideas on emergence apply to organizations, what they say about leadership style, and what implications they might have for the more sort of micro or managerial level problems as opposed to sort of macro system level problems. Obviously, there are connections across those levels, but I thought I'd offer a few remarks on emergent order within organizations and how it might be managed, because as Thibaut mentioned, I've been working on this area myself. First thing I might point out is that we could place Neil's book in a tradition, in a longer tradition of other works, especially in the management and organization and even the kind of self-help area, right, on different ways to organize human activities that are more bottom-up and less top-down. Just within the last decade or so, we've seen a whole bunch of books. Here are a few examples, books aimed at practicing managers on different ways to organize companies, to organize groups that are looser, flatter, bossless, or at least have less emphasis on the role of the boss. Frederick Laloux's Reinventing Organizations has been an influential one. Well, I'll talk in a moment about holacracy as a model of organizing companies. Gary Hamel, one of the world's most famous management writers, has written a lot on this area, including his most recent book called Humanocracy. There's even an older tradition too, going back to at least the 1960s, maybe even earlier, on more sort of humanistic management styles or less rigid, more flexible ways of organizing companies, getting away from the stereotypical Taylorite factory from 100 years ago with, an army of worker drones performing tasks that are handed down by top-level managers. Many people in our circles have read Charles Koch's book, which is mentioned also by Neil in the book as another sort of manifesto of how a more bottom-up kind of management style might be more effective than a top-down one. And there are a lot of companies, a few of them mentioned by Neil, that often get sort of trotted out as examples of private for-profit organizations that have learned how to harness the model of emergent order or spontaneous order, as opposed to the traditional kind of top-down corporate hierarchy, style. And Neil talks about Gore in his book. You've probably heard about Morningstar, the agricultural company, Valve, the video game platform, Zappos, the online retailer, and maybe some of these other firms as well that have become famous and had a lot written about them because they seem to have figured out a way to utilize emergence as a way to perform better as for-profit companies. Bill Gore, the founder of Gore, maker of Gore-Tex and other consumer products, described it this way back in the 1970s. Gore said, "The simplicity and order of an authoritarian organization make it an almost irresistible temptation." In other words, we like what looks like a very neat and clean, cleverly designed top-down firm. Yet it is counter to the principles of individual freedom and smothers the creative growth of man. Freedom requires orderly restraint. The restraints imposed by the need for cooperation are minimized with a lattice organization. That was the term Gore used for his management structure. He called it the lattice. So there's some constraint on individual freedom, but those constraints are held to a bare minimum. There are kind of more touchy-feely ways to put it. Zhang Ruimin, who's the CEO of Haier, the Chinese manufacturing company that also embraces this kind of a model, They call it Ren Dan He Yi in Chinese. And he says, with this model, we move away from being like an empire with a traditional closed pyramid to be more like a rainforest with an open networked platform. Every empire will eventually collapse. A rainforest, on the other hand, can be sustained. So I'm not exactly sure what that means. It's a little bit on the touchy-feely side, but it sort of ties into this connection between how we organize human activities and the sort of natural order of an ecosystem, which, as Neil ably explained, relies on more kind of emergent principles than top-down design. Holacracy is supposed to be a way of organizing activities that involves putting people into these sort of more fluid, concentric circles, in contrast to the traditional, top-down hierarchical pyramid that we're all familiar with. In software development, the agile Scrum framework, or methodology, as some people call it, is also meant to tap into this this notion of emergence and bottom-up design and a flatter kind of organizational structure. Some companies like Spotify have popularized a version of this model where they divide people up into squads and tribes and trios and alliances. In this case, it really turns out to be more a relabeling of the kind of conventional matrix form of organization rather than a really new design. But to turn to the themes in Neil's book and the themes of our discussion today, I mean, we all know from the penetrating insights of thinkers like Mises and Hayek on socialist organization that market-based, decentralized ways of coordinating through markets and prices and decentralized decision-making outperform top-down decision-making at the economy level, right? The question is, to what extent does that apply to companies? Does it apply to other kinds of voluntary collaborations? I mean, instinctively we think it does. I mean, look at Wikipedia, right? Everyone thinks that Wikipedia's bottom-up model has resulted in a much better encyclopedia, much more useful encyclopedia than the traditionally organized top-down hierarchical Encyclopedia Britannica. Well, I want to sort of, I wouldn't say challenge exactly, but add a little bit of nuance and some additional context to the discussion. Again, mostly focusing at the managerial or organization level, because, as Thibaut kindly mentioned, I have just published a book myself that, like Neil's, is also aimed at a popular practitioner and policymaker audience. It's on management, why managers matter, and it has this subtitle, The Perils of the Bossless Company. So we spend quite a bit of time in the book criticizing the sort of radically flat hierarchy, which is not exactly the same thing as an emergent organization, but there are strong overlaps between the two. And so I'll just briefly talk about some of the empirical history and current cases that are used normally to illustrate these claims, talk a little bit about the theory of authority and managerial hierarchy, and then look forward to the next discussant as well as the discussion. One thing to keep in mind at the organizational level, bottom-up emergence is not something brand new that was invented by Spotify or Zappos or Valve. But if you go back 100 plus years to the cooperative movement, right, worker-owned co-ops are not entirely bossless per se, but they're meant to be ways of organizing production that arise from the bottom up, right? The workers who are actually out in the field, on the assembly line, doing the physical labor and the managerial labor themselves should be the ones to figure out how to organize themselves into groups. They don't need absentee owners, they don't need hired managers and so forth to tell them what to do. So we've got a lot of experience with bottom-up modes of organization going back, a century or more. But of course, as most of you know, the cooperative model, has not, cooperatives can be effective in a few special cases, in a few industries with a few technologies, but in general, cooperatives perform much worse than traditionally organized investor-owned firms. Why? I mean, partly there's what, I call the Hansman problem, right? Building on Hansman's idea that different groups vary in their capabilities at exercising the sort of ownership and managerial functions. Groups with very heterogeneous interests, like part owner, part worker, or part owner, part supplier, part owner, part customer, that putting those people in charge of running an organization leads to a lot of incentive conflict that cannot easily be solved through exit, explaining why investor-owned companies in most cases outperform patron-owned firms. There's also the question of preferences, right? Not every employee wants to have the initiative to be, empowered to make his or her own decisions. Not every worker wants the responsibility of bearing some of the risk associated with poor organizational performance. Some might be happy to be, salaried wage earners with less responsibility. That's something that we have to take into account. On the historical side, a lot of the literature on emergence and flat organization just sort of cherry picks a few successful examples or seemingly successful examples, like some of the ones that I mentioned before. But of course, if you look at these companies carefully, a lot of them were only successful for a few years and then either reverted back to a traditional hierarchical model, or they went bankrupt, or they were bought up, or there was some kind of a crisis that meant the emergent flat model wasn't really sustainable. And of course, if you do a more systematic analysis of with a broad sample of organizations, and we try to relate performance to organizational form, there's very little evidence that decentralized firms making better use of emergence systematically perform better than firms organized along more traditional lines. And I mean, to what extent does this apply also at the more macro level? Right, we say, the superior properties of the common law as opposed to the Napoleonic Code or other civil law systems, the fact that emergent languages are better than, Esperanto or other sort of centrally planned languages, the fact that, we have many examples of markets in which technology standards emerge spontaneously. All of this is evidence for emergence as a more general model. Again, we have to be really cautious here that we're not, just sort of sampling on the dependent variable and picking a few examples that seem to illustrate the point we want to make while missing other counterexamples that might make us question our thinking. In terms of theory, look, as we all know, when you ask an economist, do you think strategy X or strategy Y is better, policy A or policy B? The economy, that's where you want your one-handed economist, right? Who won't say on the one hand, on the other hand, because normally what economists are good at doing is not identifying optimal policies, right? But elucidating trade-offs and helping decision makers think about how to balance those trade-offs. And emergence or decentralization is no different. Right? More decentralized modes of organizations have benefits, but they also have costs. The benefits are very obvious, right? And have been elucidated very clearly by Neil in the book and also in the presentation, right? The Hayekian idea of making better use of tacit dispersed knowledge, providing high-powered performance-based incentives for people at lower levels of the organization who are now free to use their tacit knowledge to make decisions that can be better for the whole. However, and Neil mentioned this, there are also some possible drawbacks of more decentralized modes of organization, right? Agency problems and coordination problems. Neil mentioned externalities, but I would say we don't even have to use externality language to recognize that there are cases where, the pieces don't fit together, right? Wherever you need to coordinate a set of activities, sometimes the price mechanism, sometimes property rights and the price mechanism are not as effective as more centrally directed coordination. Again, think about within organizations, the classic assembly line, right? You need each stage of the assembly line to be, each worker at each stage of the assembly line to be performing his or her task in a way that it matches up with what other workers are doing. Everyone's working at the right speed, the different pieces, fit one as you go from stage to stage. Doing that in a fully autonomous, decentralized emergent model would probably be a very ineffective way to produce automobiles or other kinds of manufactured goods. What we argue in our book is that there are specific criteria one can use in deciding when do the benefits of decentralization outweigh the costs. And we say, or sorry, to put it the other way around, these key factors are the preferences of employees, the urgency of making certain decisions quickly, and the degree of interdependence among tasks, jobs, and subunits. So where employees have a strong preference for autonomy and independence, where it's often not necessary for the organization as a whole to adapt quickly, and where tasks, jobs, and subunits are relatively autonomous or highly modular. There's little interdependence among tasks, jobs, and subunits. Then more decentralized models emphasizing emergence tend to perform better. But when the opposite is true, more central coordination can actually yield some benefits. And I just want to mention my last point here. The way Neil frames it in the book is, to draw a rhetorical distinction between emergence and control. I might nitpick a little bit the use of the word control in that context, because I think control or authority can have a broader set of meanings. I think what we often think authority or control means is, sort of top-down, day-to-day oversight of every single task the subordinate performs. And in the book, referring to some work by Herbert Simon, right, we distinguish between what we call type 1 authority or type 2 authority. Type 1 is command and control. The boss tells the worker what to do and the worker does it. And we think, gosh, that doesn't seem to be a very effective way of managing organizations in the presence of tacit knowledge and empowered knowledge-based workers, et cetera, et cetera. And that's probably true. But there's another kind of authority or control, what we call type 2 authority, which is where the role of the boss is not to tell people what to do, but to design, implement, and enforce what you might call the rules of the game, the policies and procedures within which people can interact. And when I discuss this in my classroom, I always use the example of Wikipedia, because students get it. Right? We all know that Wikipedia is better than the traditional Encyclopedia Britannica, as was already mentioned, because it's bottom up and it's not top down, and because it doesn't have a boss, right? No one is in charge of Wikipedia. There's no boss of Wikipedia, right? And I let the students think about this and discuss it. And then I say, wrong, there is a boss of Wikipedia, or there was a boss of Wikipedia, namely Jimmy Wales, right? The co-founder of the Wikipedia project, the guy who, along with a team of colleagues, wrote the code for the Wikipedia platform, right? And Wells is an interesting guy who apparently was inspired by Hayek to create Wikipedia. But what does it mean to say that that Jimmy Wales is the boss of Wikipedia? Does it mean he writes the entries? No, of course not. Does it mean he personally edits and handles all the problems behind the scenes to make Wikipedia run smoothly? No, but it means he created a platform within which people can write articles, people can edit other people's articles, people can engage in flame wars about the content of articles, and other people can step in and try to moderate those disputes. So Jimmy Wales created the framework within which emergence can take place. And oftentimes we neglect the notion of we neglect the importance of that framework, right? So just to wrap up, decentralized emergent management will work well in some cases, but not in all cases, right? And some of the firms mentioned where you have independent projects, high degrees of modularity, but these models generally don't scale very well. And so the message of our book is that there's no one size fits all solutions, right? Emergence works well in some cases, but not in others. So what should good managers do? They should learn how to exercise what I call type 2 authority well, smartly, right? Knowing how to structure their organization so that good solutions will emerge, which also involves knowing when to step in and fix things, not too much, but occasionally, understanding whether these contingencies like interdependence are weak or strong, and sort of understanding and dealing with the possible limits to more emergent forms of organization. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much. Neil, I suggest that we first hear from Asta, and then we give you 1 or 2 seconds so that you can answer them, right? A bit more than that. But so Asta, I introduced you already. You're, as I'm sure you will discuss, I've published quite a few papers discussing dynamic capabilities. And of course, I'm very curious, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, to hear also from David during the discussion part. But so it's hard for me to try to model or compute what is the relationship between all your work on dynamic capability and the one on emergence. And I'm sure you have an answer to this. So please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting Timo, Bo, and colleagues to really read the book. It arrived before the New Year Eve, and it was very nice experience reading it. My relationship with complexity is quite long. Actually, starting with a dissertation that was some time ago, I will not mention that, but complex problem solving is something within not only management works, but also my psychological career pathway, that started some time ago. So in general, thank you for inviting, and I already recommended book to my colleagues, to my PhDs, my colleagues in academia, business, and including policymakers. My PhD was asking, like, is it a scientific book, or is it academic book, or book for entertainment, or so to say, fiction? Actually, Neil answered that you perceive it as not academic book, but I would say it's both. To my understanding, it really follows major features of scientific work, of being systemic and referring back to the theories, and well grounded with arguments, accurate. So in that sense, really, it's possible to get back. It reminded me, by the way, what David is usually saying, start with fundamental question or fundamental problem, so the reminded questions why as very important in digging all important issues in research. But on the other hand, besides that, I really felt as it is a very good book for the leisure time and inspiring intellectual discourse, getting back to the review of the theories. I'm not economist myself, right? But working with David and reading seminal works, getting into that. So for me, it was very interesting to see a nice summary of major economic theories. And on the other hand, that I think what is very important, the complementarity of introspection of all the experience Neil had, and introspection already a tool of psychologists really, and research methodology, by the way, to investigate and explore some complex phenomena through the eyes of the researcher, through the eyes of the author, and to understand and to share the understanding with the audience. So I think it was a very nice way of tuning introspection with general discussion on emergent order, and that gave a general sense of empathy, that many of us had that feeling that complexity and emergent order really makes an impact, and the feeling, that have we checked all options? Have we selected the best option? It's today, I would say, the major issues also with young people, with their mental well-being, mental health, young people, but also matured people thinking like, have we made the best decision, most informed decision in that sense. But so it's really excellent book in both sense. And getting back to competition innovation, I also made a couple of observations to myself. So it was really reading as a dialogue, and the ideas in the book really stimulated some thinking. For example, what about the life cycle of emergent order? So is emergent order is the same at different stages of the development? It looks like emergent order in new markets where we do not have dominant design, right? Very much stimulates breakthrough innovations, while emergent order in matured markets where we have dominant design it comes with incremental innovations, right? For example, if we take GAFAM platforms, Google platform or any other of these, 15 years ago when they started, there was no understanding what is a platform, how it worked. Of course, it was within the emergent order, you know, but the emergent order at its best, with no regulations that really restricts or any discussions on antitrust. That is today. And while the platform economy evolved and get, well, not matured, but maturing, the emergent order gets more ordered. And even we still can observe it. Governments, they come up with the discussions on antitrust, and the current startups, platform startups, they already have to deal with much more burden, and their scaling possibilities are much more cut down in comparison to the GAFAM platforms that were emerging 15 years ago. So in that sense, I had a feeling that emergent order as a phenomenon, it's very much there, but how it differs in different maturity levels of the markets, you know, so how it's related in general. Again, this is related with contextual factors, and recently we started a new piece of work, a new paper with my Spanish colleagues, and we confirmed, actually it's quite a counterintuitive, but we confirmed that better quality of governance or higher scores in governance index is not in favor for scaling of startups, and actually the best of emergent order is really it's really not that impactful as it might be. So in that sense, EU environment as very ordered, strict, and rule-governed environment for business and development, it's less favorable than US. And it's not new discussion, but it was new in the context of emergent order. Again, another aspect that I was thinking about, and Tibor, I saw it's 5 minutes, I will try to close it soon. The examples from biology, I think it's an excellent way to show what is emergent order, but if we take birds or ants, they follow DNR program very closely, so they follow the decisions of genes. Humans and society, they edit genes, so they are not following, you know, that program. They do what they want with the genes in general, and that means that the emergent order is even more emergent. So the mess is even more mess in general, at the best of it is. So it reminds me what Joachim Funke was saying about complex social systems, that actually they are complex, that's true, but they also latent in reactions. So they feature latency, also intransparency. So this is two features that are very important to understand, that in emergent order, there is no enough information for decisions in general. And that's why some reactions are late. So you can understand what is happening only after some time, and you have to take a decision not knowing about what is already happening, but you don't know. And this is not very nice for big companies. Currently, actually, David and I were working with Siemens, Healthineers, Oracle, and usually what they're saying, just tell to our board, we don't know when the profits will come. Just tell them. And you cannot say, okay, it's an emergent order. It's something that is unclear. Of course, it's coming. But I would say for companies to understand and know when the profits are coming is still the main issue in the game, how to deal with that. And probably the last statement that I would like to make, actually two very short. Helfat and colleagues are talking about strategic dynamic theory of the firms, summarizing that actually we can shape, adapt, and constrain competition, dynamic competition. So in some sense, I understand that we should give up a control in emergent systems, and I'm a believer. I really believe that control has more negative than good sides. But probably what Neil did, Neil, you wrote the first part of the book, convincing that control in emergent system is counter-effective. But I'm really looking forward for the second part of the book, telling how to shape, the emergent order, emergent systems. Also thinking about, shaping as influencing perceptions, incentivizing. So in some sense, creating culture, right? But all these tools that help us not to control, but to shape and ease the life of new types of organizations as platforms, Web3, right? It's also new decentralized autonomous organizations that are coming. So a lot of new happenings that I would say would benefit from the second part of your book. So thanks a lot for the book, and it was great reading.
Thank you very much. Here is what I propose we do. Neil, I'll just give you 1 or 2 minutes. I know it's nearly impossible, but just for that to be on the record, right? And then you could probably elaborate on your answers in part 2 of the conversation. What I want to do is to give you 1 or 2 minutes, pass the mic to Bo, who would then moderate part 2. And I'm sure that because Bo is all about fairness, he will then give the floor to David first, because I can see, David, you are waiting to comment on what you've heard. So Neil, for a brief response, and then Bo, you can take it from there.
Yeah, well, I won't take too long. I mean, there's so much that both of you have given me to think about. Peter, I can't wait to read your book, and Asta, I'd love to read the paper that you mentioned. Yeah, I mean, in particular, Peter, to your point, to your presentation, I didn't talk about that part of the book at all in my presentation, so I apologize. Which means I'm a little less fresh on it, frankly, than I would be. But one of the things that I was grappling with is, the theory of a firm. I think you're totally right that the sort of perception maybe in the business world is that emergence means no hierarchy, and that's not true in nature at all. In fact, emergent systems are defined, complex systems are defined by signals, boundaries, and hierarchy. I mean, you get hierarchy when you have boundaries and signals, and all that means is that you're abstracting some things away in certain components, and then there's information that's flowing between those components to others. So I think for management, that means you're 100% right that not only is there not one size fits all, but it certainly can't be the case that no hierarchy is the solution. The way I've talked about it is that the only thing that's completely decentralized, I think it's particularly true to Asta's last point there, in the Web3 world, there's a sort of idea that we'll just decentralize everything. And the only thing I can think of that's purely like perfectly decentralized would be like the heat death of the universe, right? Like everything else has hierarchies, right? And order. And so, so I can't wait to read your book and figure out more about like what that means for the theory of the firm and what that means for management. As Asta pointed out, like the second half of the book was me grappling with, all right, things are complex. Like what do you do as an individual? And what do you do in the hierarchies that you're in? And I think I don't have a perfect answer to that, but so I'm hoping your book does, Peter. And then Asta, I love thanks so much for the kind words, and I love the idea of the different roles that emergence might play in different sets of constraints. That's sort of what you were talking about in the established markets versus new markets. You mentioned animals being controlled by their genes. One of the most fascinating sections that I dug into when researching the book, Melanie Mitchell's book, Complexity, A Guided Tour, is very good. But she digs pretty deep on the genetic thing. I did not realize how many strange feedback loops there are in your genes. I think I just sort of thought it was like code and it just got read once, but there's all these crazy mechanisms in genetics that have feedback loops. I don't think it's an emergent system itself in crazy ways that is really complicated. And so even for the animals who are controlled by their genes, the genes are, man, it's a wild world. I had no idea about that. So I love that. And then on Web3, one of the big misses in my book is that I didn't mention Web3. I feel like maybe I could have sold a lot more books. I could have caught that wave, but I was working on sort of Web3 stuff, but I don't know why I didn't put it in there. And like, I keep like kicking myself. It's the other thing, I think, on top of that. And the, as I was mentioning, calling it Rock Creek Highway, that you know, like I would go back and change about the book. So I think that connection is important and useful. And I think technology is trying to find ways to do this stuff. And, you know, always goes through these waves of sort of decentralization, centralization, closed gardens, open protocols. And so I think we're, again, swinging towards the open protocol side of things, you know, provided the regulators and antitrust enforcers don't artificially stop that. I can't wait to hear what the rest of you have to say, especially David.
Thanks a lot, Niels. You're getting me very excited, of course, talking about Web3, but for now, I would just pass the mic to Bo and